Just by way of introduction to Dr. David Kilcullen, he is probably one of the world's foremost thinkers on counter-insurgency and military strategy. He is the author of a fascinating book, The Accidental Guerilla, Counter-Insurgency and Out of the Mountains. He was formerly Senior Counterinsurgency Advisor to General David Petraeus, who's speaking here on Friday. And he's also advised Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State in the US. So we're delighted, David, to have you here this afternoon. And as you would have seen as you came into the room, copies of his new book, Blood Year, Islamic State and the Failures of the War on Terror, copies of that are available outside. So without further ado, David, thank you very much.
Thank you. I might take the podium so everyone can see me. What I thought I'd do is spend about 20 minutes or so offending as many people as I possibly can, and hopefully that'll give us enough to talk about, right? And then we can have what I think is going to be more interesting, which will be the question and answer slant competitive speech giving part at the end. So,
just before Dan starts, on the record for your talk, and then we'll go off the record for the Q&As afterwards. Thank you.
So let me sort of tell you a little bit about the book. I wrote it for two reasons. One, because the rise of ISIS in the last 2 to 3 years essentially undermines a lot of the trends that we thought were developing in the global war on terrorism. There was a period where it seemed like it was going okay, from sort of mid-2010 until about the end of 2012. And, you know, here in the UK, successful delivery of the Olympics, reform of border security, a bunch of internal surveillance and intelligence stuff seemed to be keeping us safe. In the States, the application of special operations and drone strikes and a raft of fairly intrusive security measures also seem to be working. Clearly, the rise of ISIS shows that that's not the case. And so the book is not really about ISIS per se. It's about what the rise of ISIS tells us about the war on terrorism and how to think about that going forward. And, you know, you still need to read the book, but I can summarize it in 3 or 4 words. You know, it tells us it's failed and we need to think about it in a different way. Second reason that I wrote the book is, and I think a story will illustrate this. December 2012, I was out in a Navy SEAL outpost in a little place called Dayak, which is far southeastern Afghanistan, about 50 miles outside the ring road, Indian country, as they say, and very, very dangerous, constantly being attacked, and this Navy SEAL team was kind of struggling to cope with the environment. And as I was leaving after working with them for a period, I'm on the LZ, on the helicopter pad, and I saw a Navy radio operator who looked about 12 years old. And I said to the guy, "How old are you, mate?" And he said, "I'm 19 years old." So that's a kid who was in primary school on 9/11, and since the beginning of the war on terror, has left primary school, finished high school, joined the Navy, become a SEAL, and he was already on his second tour in Afghanistan. So it's so long ago now, 9/11, that those of us that remember it and were involved in the early period of the war on terrorism are to some extent a minority of the guys that are actually doing it on the ground. And there's a whole new generation of people that, to them, like, it's history. And so I wanted to go back in a thoroughly non-partisan way and say what actually happened, what worked, what went wrong, and what does that tell us about where we are now. What I want to do for the next 15 or 20 minutes, though, is I want to describe how I see the threat from ISIS now and put out a framework that helps us think about it. And hopefully that'll give us, as I say, enough material that we can have a fruitful conversation. So there are many names for this group, right? Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, you know, the variety of different names that are out there. And I think the fact that we have different names for it suggests that there's still a fair degree of confusion about what is it actually that we're dealing with here. And I don't want to commit the offense of quoting Clausewitz at Russi, but, you know, Clausewitz says, you know, what I think is one of the most important lines in his book, that the first duty of the soldier and statesman is rightly to understand the war in which they're engaged, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that it's not. And I think that's very much what we've tried to do at different times in the war on terrorism. So what I want to do is lay out what I consider to be the 3 layers of the threat and describe each of those in detail. At the central layer of the threat is a state-like entity, the Central Islamic State, as I'm going to call it, that currently controls about a quarter of Iraq and about a third of Syria. It controls a population of about 6 million people, so roughly the size of Singapore or a small Scandinavian country. It has an annual government revenue somewhere in the vicinity of $600 to $800 million. That's come down a little bit in the last 6 months, but still, even at that level, puts it beyond the realm of any terrorist group in history, with the exception of the FARC at the height of the drug war in Colombia. So it's at the level of a small nation state, as distinct from a terrorist group. It has both a military administration and a civil administration. It has law courts. It levies taxes. It has a small business administration, runs hospitals, has schools, exercises price control, and basically thinks of itself as a state and fights like a state. About 35% of the senior leadership group of that core central organization are former Ba'ath military from Saddam Hussein's regime or people that have defected from the Syrian military. So we're talking about an organization that has a fair bit of more or less conventional military expertise in the way that it thinks about conflict. Obviously, historically, it grows from al-Qaeda in Iraq, but it also grows from the Syrian civil war. So there's a Syrian element and an Iraqi element to the construct. But of course, it also has a very large number of foreign fighters. At this point, the flow rate of foreign fighters to join ISIS is 10 to 12 times as big as anything we saw at the height of the war in Iraq. And not only is the flow much bigger, the composition of that flow is different. Many more women, roughly twice as many women proportionally, as we saw with al-Qaeda. Very young. Average age of al-Qaeda foreign fighters was mid-teens to mid-20s. Average age of ISIS recruits is 12 to 19. And we're seeing a really significant shift in the types of people going to join. So unlike al-Qaeda, which was sort of like a special forces organization, it didn't recruit, it selected from people that wanted to already join, and it ran selection courses and downscaled to a very small cadre of capable players. ISIS is out there recruiting as many people as it can for this central state-like entity, and one of the reasons, paradoxically, why there are so many foreign recruits is that ISIS's standards are so low. And they don't really expect you to know anything about Islam or have any military skills or any physical fitness or any knowledge of the region. They just want you in the tent so that they can train, and they have about 14 training camps now across Syria and Iraq, and also so that there's a very large cloud of what you might describe as useful idiots who are out there to give us a targeting challenge, while their more elite units are organising within that more cluttered detection environment. So that's the central state. I know it's slightly controversial to describe it as a state. I'm going to fudge a little bit and say that it's a state-like entity or a state-building enterprise. I don't think we're going to recognise it as a state, nor should we. I don't think that it is something we want to be necessarily broadcasting publicly, but from a targeting standpoint, we need to be thinking about it as an entity that controls roughly a dozen cities, several million people, and functions like a state, and therefore is different from a terrorist organisation. Let's talk about the second layer, which is the territorial provinces, or wilayat, the sort of external territories of the Islamic State. Now in 11 countries, shortly to be in 12, across from West Africa through North Africa, Horn of Africa, into Southeast Asia, an increasing number of people in Bangladesh and Thailand associated with the group, not formal wilayats in those areas, but the emergence in particular of a wilayat in Afghanistan in the last year. So we're seeing 11 countries, 79 countries that these groups have carried out attacks in, and a structure that looks on its surface a little bit like the old al-Qaeda franchises. But there's a difference. Where the al-Qaeda franchises were guerrilla groups that were trying to overthrow local states as part of a global, protracted warfare, united front strategy that Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were putting forward, the Islamic State territories are much more territorial in their focus. They are trying to carve out terrain, govern population, control cities, and they are thinking about things in a much more conventional military manner. And their model is much more the 7th century expansion of Islam than the sort of global revolution that bin Laden has talked about in the past. So what they are thinking about is that there'll be a relatively conventional military conquest and expansion coming out of Iraq and Syria, and they'll be sort of bridgeheads that allow that to link up. They vary a lot in degree of capability. They also vary somewhat in the way that they approach the fight. But I think that this second layer, the wilayat, is a really important resiliency tool for the central Islamic State. You guys may be aware, of course, that in the last few months, the military situation in Iraq has actually improved significantly. It began to improve at the end of October, and it's continued to improve, I won't say dramatically, but rather significantly since then. And yet, when they began to lose ground in Iraq, because of the existence of the wilayats, ISIS were able to strike back in Paris, in a couple of places in North Africa and elsewhere, as a way of compensating for lost territory and giving us, again, a bandwidth problem to try to deal with a variety of threats at once. So there's a lot of opportunities that arise for a group like Islamic State when it not only has a central conventional state-like element, but it has these almost fraternal parties, to use an earlier way of thinking about revolution, out there in different countries that it can call upon. Third layer, and to continue that idea of an older way of thinking about world revolution, the third layer is what I would call the international, the ISIS international. And if there are roughly 32,000 active fighters in the central state and about the same number but scattered across 11 wilayats in the territorial area, there are vastly more people, even though it's harder to tell how many, in that international. Just as one indicator, a few weeks ago, Twitter suspended 125,000 accounts that it considered to be linked to ISIS. So 125,000 Twitter accounts is not 125,000 people, right? People can have multiple accounts. But it does suggest that we're looking at a very substantial, albeit very amorphous, network of people that are associated in some way with the Islamic State. This organization, in fact, it's not really an organization. It's a series of individuals, adhocracies, as we describe them, small groups and cells that are either self-radicalized, they might be remotely radicalized by somebody reaching out through electronic means and operationalizing an individual to carry out an attack, or they might be part of older networks that have accreted onto ISIS through a process of acquisition. So the Bout Chaumont network, who did the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, is a good example of a pre-existing network of sort of paramilitary players in Europe that joined the Islamic State in a fairly informal manner. The Sousa attack, where 30 British tourists were killed last year in Tunisia, is an example of an individual who was radicalized deliberately by members of Islamic State and Ansar al-Sharia. So there's a variety of different recruitment patterns in that approach. What I would say is that at that level we're dealing with something that's really, it's not unprecedented, but it's very different from what we dealt with al-Qaeda. And that is in large part because of the massive explosion in electronic connectivity that's happened since 9/11. And I wrote about this a lot in my last book, so I won't go over it in great detail. But just as one fact, in the year 2000, there were a total of 30,000 cell phones for all of Nigeria. By 2012, there were 113 million. That's a 280,000% increase in about a decade. And that's not unusual for the developing world. What that means is that you can sit in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel or in West Africa and reach out to immigrant populations or to people that you know or to people that are allied with you politically anywhere in the world, and not only pass propaganda messages, but pass operational targeting messages and engage in training and orient people in a way that helps them to participate in an organized uprising. And that's something that al-Qaeda really never grasped, because by the time that these capabilities came into play a few years ago, they were already head down, being chased around Pakistan by American drone strikes. So that's the three layers of the threat, as I see it. They all collaborate at times. When you push on the threat in one part, you tend to get a pushback somewhere else. I've not mentioned Syria directly, but I'm going to end with this point. I think that the biggest threat that we see from ISIS is in fact not the terrorist threat. It's much more of a conventional geopolitical threat in the Middle East and basically a straight-up hot state-on-state war that's going on in Syria and in Iraq, and the side effects of that dramatically outweigh anything that either Al-Qaeda or ISIS have ever done to date. So, in the entire period since 9/11, leaving aside battle casualties in Iraq, Al-Qaeda only succeeded in killing about less than 10,000 people. ISIS, in all of its terrorist attacks, has killed less than 5,000. But we've had 270,000 Syrians killed now in the Syrian civil war, 11 million displaced people, 1.1 million refugees into Europe last year. The EU a few weeks ago projected that it will be 3 million additional refugees in the next 2 years. And that's the major impact of the conflict. And we can get into how this came about. And I should say that I've pulled no punches in the book about whose fault different parts of this chain of events has been, including mine. So I'm not here to sort of throw rocks at other people and pat myself on the back and say, I did a great job. We all, including the UK government, frankly, made some errors over the past 15 years. But the situation now is very different than what we've seen before. I think we now are looking at a much more dangerous international terrorism situation than we've seen at any time since 9/11. We're now dealing with not one, but two global terrorist organizations, and we're dealing with that against the backdrop of a much more fragmented, much more dangerous environment in the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia, and with a population and a set of political leaders that are so war-weary that it's incredibly difficult to see how we're going to muster the political will to do what would be needed to put a lid back on the threat. So on that very cheery note, I'm going to stop ranting and Richard,